Good afternoon. Welcome back, everyone, and welcome to those of you who are joining for the first time today to the Australia-China Biodiversity Dialogue. I am chairing this panel today on the land of the Waterbird people of the Darug Nation. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and future. This panel is dedicated to the Migratory Bird Treaty agreement, between Australia and the People's Republic of China. It's quite fascinating, really, to have a bilateral treaty, the subject of a panel. I think it's also obviously quite appropriate, given that it's a bilateral treaty between Australia and China, given the focus of our conference. I noted when having a look back over this treaty that the preamble concludes with the following sentence. The parties have reached the following agreement as a result of friendly discussions. So I hope that preamble sort of takes us through to today's panel discussion. I'm sure it will, and that we can continue and even evolve, perhaps, those friendly discussions which took place all the way back now in 1988. So the first speaker we're going to have today is Professor Guangchun Lei. So I'll just give you some details of the professor's profile before he begins. Professor Guangchun Lei is a professor at the School of Ecology and Nature Conservation, Beijing Forestry University, and the director of the Center for East Asia Australasia Flyway Studies. He's also the chairman of the Science and Technology Committee of the International Convention on Wetlands, the vice chairman and secretary general of the National Wetland Science and Technology Committee, a member of the advisory committee of the State Forestry and Grassland Administration, a member of the National Park Expert Committee of the State Forestry, State Forestry and Grassland Administration, and the chairman of the Shenzhen Mangrove Wetland Conservation Foundation. So many accolades there. Professor has published 165 scientific and technical papers, which is astounding, and has received many awards, including the Luke Hoffman Lifetime Achievement Award for Wetland Science and Conservation by Wetlands International in 2018. So I pass over to you, Professor.
Thank you very much, Paul, for your introduction. I'm now start sharing my. As Paul introduced, we did have China-Australian bilateral migratory waterbird agreement. And that was one of the earliest one. And we do have China, Japan, China, Russia, China, Korea agreement on migratory waterbirds, as well as China-US nature conservation agreement. And with the implementation of the bilateral agreement, we feel maybe it's necessary to have a whole flyway agreement. So today, I'm going to talk about the East Asia, Australasia Flyway agreement. That's actually a truly partnership program, effort between Australia and China of the past 30 years. So it started in Brisbane. So I will go into some details. So this agreement has this focus on water nose and migratory waterbird population declining. And to address these issues, the partnership calls on government, international organizations, non-government protected area managers, as well as scientists to come together to develop common visions and have the common strategies to work on the flyway conservation. So we can see on global scale, we have 9 global flyways, among which in the middle, we can see the East Asia, Australasia flyway in the red line included areas. We do see also some other Western Pacific flyway, Central Asia flyway, but the most important flyway is the Central East Asia, Australasia flyway globally. So in not only with the diversity of species, but also with the population status. And in the early assessment, this flyway has the highest number of threatened or endangered species. And many of the threatened species, their population declining at a very fast speed, over 10% a year. So that's the status. So as I mentioned, this agreement actually initiated 30 years ago when we have the Ramsar conference of the parties in Brisbane. And that's the proposal to start an Asia Pacific Migratory Waterbird Conservation Committee. And in 2002, with the Australian government, Japan government, as well as Wetlands International, jointly proposed to World Summit on Sustainable Development in South Africa as Type 2 partnership. This means a non-binding voluntary agreement. So once this has been established under the World Summit, and this since 2002 series of workshops we started, and finally, actually we finalized the partnership agreement documents in Australia in 2004, and in 2006 we officially launched this agreement. So as you can see from the picture down on the left-hand side, in the middle is Jason, is the chief delegate from Australia. The one actually in the third in that pictures. In 2009, the Secretariat established in Yuncheng in South Korea, and 2018, the science unit established in Beijing Forestry University. So that's where I'm working on now. So there's a very important steps in developing or defining this agreement. I just show you some pictures. Many of those has been still work on the migratory waterbirds conservation in this region. We now have 39 partners, and more are expected to join in. We can see this flyway covers 22 countries. So now we have 18 countries, government are on the board. And we have our international organizations, the NGOs, the corporate, and the companies. And we identified our 1,000 key habitat for those migratory waterbirds in this flyway. And we can see those among those 1,000 key habitats, 60 are now Ramsar sites. So this number is growing. I have not included this year's new figure, and 149 are the network protected area within this agreement. And if we look at the importance of each site and their contribution to the flyway, we can see many of the China sites are at the top of their contribution. So we did an assessment on 1,060 sites in value, their contribution to the whole flyway. So in Point Lake, it's definitely number one contributor. It's got 1,056 scores. And the second one is the Australian, it's 80 miles beach, 677. The Yenton marshland. So Yenton marsh was inscribed as the World Heritage Sites, and more of those sites underneath. These are the Bohai Bay, Yellow River Delta, and many others are now in the process to nominate as the World Heritage Site. Under this agreement, we do have set up for major working groups. Under each working groups, there are special task forces work on specifically on these critical endangered species conservation action plans, and to organizing all the experts across the world to provide advice, guidance, prepare guidelines, species conservation plans. So those are really to help the partners, including the government and the NGOs and the site managers, to implement the agreement. And then very newly, we have the seabirds working groups established. And this is including 150 species of seabirds. The partnership was to provide all different kinds of support for the partners. Most importantly, we have this World Heritage Site nomination. So in particular, the Yellow Sea, we can see from Australia, New Zealand to Russia, United States. The Yellow Sea is in the middle, and this location is unavoidable stopping sites for many of the shorebirds. They must stop at this location to feed for 5 to 6 weeks to recharge. So in order to continue the second flight to the breeding sites or to the wintering sites. And we do also support the ASEAN with their migratory waterbird conservation, apart from each of the countries' program. And this agreement also have clearly defined the responsibilities of the partners. So over the past 15, 16 years, we have held 10 conference of partners. We call it, the last one is MOP 10. It was hosted in Hainan Island in China. The next one will be in Australia, in Brisbane in next year. And each partner are encouraged to participate in management of the Secretariat. The Flyway network size is to designate more sites into the Flyway network sites and also host partners meeting. And the newly actually hold the MOP 10 have all updated decisions. The partners are encouraged to support implementation of MOP decisions and support network sites implementation, and SEPA organizing international regional conferences, and in addition also the project support. So recently we are working on the Flyway Regional Initiative with the support from ADB and a number of international organizations, aiming to generate actually to get about $3 billion project to support the key sites. And in 2018, we just endorsed a 10-year strategy, the 2020 to 2030. So this strategy including strengthening cooperation. So this is strengthen linkages among partners, including joint project Flyway initiatives, establishing or building national partnerships. For each country, they are encouraged to including all the partners, stakeholders into this process as a national partnership, and to improve the capacity of partner focal points. Most importantly, to achieve financial sustainability. Second one is to the expansion of the Flyway network site. So the objective is to have 1,000 plus the important habitat into the Flyway network, and to support the existing Flyway network sites to building management capacity, and to promote community-based participation in Flyway network site management. And also the strengthen site managers network, both in nationally and the Flyway site, promoting sister network sites. We do have a number of sister sites under this mechanism. And SEPA is one of the most important one to mainstreaming migratory waterbird conservation. We're using World Migratory Waterbird, Bird Day, World Wetland Day, and the SEPA toolkits and hosting festivals. SEPA involve Flyway network sites and also the nature schools. And do have key researcher joint studies to understanding migratory waterbirds and their habitat. And under this, we have the technical committee. We have this science unit. So that's the supporting working groups and task forces. Assessment of migratory waterbirds and their habitats. This is most of my staff are working on. The key of this agreement is actually building on global sustainable development agenda, especially through the migratory waterbirds connecting people and nature. So I'm very grateful, Professor Liu, in his opening remarks, talking about why we have this Australian China partnership. So we have our migratory waterbirds. They are connecting the two countries and the people. China has played a very important role. We hold two partners conference. We established the science unit. All the Flyway network work site has been supported by the 13th, 14th five-year plan. So that means if you are a network site, you have the privilege to get government funding from central government as well as the social funding. And for the migratory waterbird conservation, many of the species are upgraded into national protected species. In this year, the wetland conservation law is promulgated under the wetland conservation and restoration orders by the State Council, which means all the government has their obligations, responsibility to restore degraded wetland, in particular in respect to the waterbird habitat. So the coastal wetland conservation and World Heritage nomination. So to support this, the Center for East Asia, Australasia Flyway Studies established. So I thank you very much. I should be very grateful if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. I don't see any questions yet in the chat or in the Q&A. Hopefully, though, we'll get some between now and the end of the panel discussion. One point that I would like to raise or to just sort of emphasize is the different layering of different treaties as well that seems to regulate the migratory patterns of birds between not just Australia and China, of course, but among the whole flight path. Ramsar in particular being one that seemed to have quite a lot of emphasis in the professor's presentation there and explanation. Okay, so we'll move now to our next speaker. Yep. Our next speaker is Dr. Emma Carmody, and she'll be speaking on the topic of bilateral and multilateral environmental treaties, opportunities and challenges. I'll just quickly go through Emma's bio before she begins her presentation. So Dr. Emma Carmody is an international environmental lawyer and environmental entrepreneur with particular expertise in wetlands, freshwater, and the intersection between human rights and water. Emma spent more than 10 years working as a lawyer at the Environmental Defender's Office, a role, excuse me, a role which included advising and collaborating with farmers, First Nations peoples, and communities at a grassroots level across Australia. At the other end of the governance spectrum, Emma has served as sole legal advisor to the Secretariat of the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands since 2017, a position which requires her to advise during complex multilateral negotiations among member states and as well as intersession panels. Emma is a member of the Wentworth Group of Concerned Scientists and sits on the Strategic Advisory Council of the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation. She enjoys collaborating with experts from different disciplines and has co-authored numerous peer-reviewed articles and book chapters with ecologists, hydrologists, social scientists, economists, and First Nations water experts. In early 2022, Emma co-founded a for-purpose business called Restore Blue, the objective of which is to work with local communities to restore lost blue carbon wetlands at scale in Australia and the Asia Pacific region. Emma, I pass over to you.
Thanks, Paul. I'll just, there we go. Thank you. I'd just like to begin by acknowledging that I'm coming to you all from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to extend my thanks to the organisers of this workshop and in particular to Michelle Lim, who kindly invited me to present today. I apologise in advance for my husky voice. I've been a little unwell and I hope that you can all understand me throughout the presentation. As I was actually writing the presentation, I did realise that I was deviating a little bit from its title. So I apologise in advance because what I've done is really play to my strength, which is to focus quite heavily on the convention with which I am most familiar, which is of course the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands. I've served as the legal advisor to the Convention Secretariat in Switzerland for the last 5 years, but I've also been involved in domestic legal work, which has aimed to protect Ramsar sites in Australia. So I'm familiar with it from both ends of the governance spectrum. I have attempted to examine it through the lens of Canberra and look for intersections between the convention and the protection of migratory birds. And I'm pleased to say that there is some overlap between my presentation and the presentation of Professor Guangcheng Lei. So I'll just expand a little bit on some of the points that he has already made based on his deep knowledge of this particular space. So I thought I'd begin just by providing some very brief background to the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands. As some of you would already know, it's the world's oldest multilateral environmental agreement. And it was adopted in Ramsar in Iran in 1971. So if there's one thing that you all take away from this particular presentation is that Ramsar is a place, it is not an acronym. People commonly capitalize it, but in fact, it's located in Iran, hence the name of the convention. The convention then entered into force 4 years later in 1975. And early on, there were only 18 contracting parties to the convention, but in 2022, we now have 172 contracting parties, and the most recent of which to sign and ratify the Ramsar Convention is Burkina Faso. And if you consider that the UN has some 190 member states, that's really the vast majority of the world's nations that have signed and ratified this particular MEA. You can have a look at the website of the Ramsar Convention Secretariat, and you can see when each of those 172 countries signed and ratified the convention, and you can also see where their listed Ramsar wetlands are located within their national territories. But for the purposes of this presentation, I thought I'd just point out that It entered into force in Australia very early on in the life of the convention, so in 1975, and then in China in 1992. Oh, and that's just a little photo actually that was taken at the last Ramsar Standing Committee meeting a few weeks ago in Switzerland. So this is really just a collection of some of the key articles of the convention that I thought I'd share with you. The first is one that often intrigues students when I'm teaching them about the Ramsar Convention, and it's that wetlands under the convention are defined extremely broadly, as you can see there from the text of the presentation. And they also cover natural and artificial wetlands. So there are a number of artificial wetlands that have been listed around the world, which people often find quite curious, but those artificial wetlands often become quite an important habitat for a range of species, including, in some instances, migratory birds. Article 2.1 of the Convention provides for the creation of what we call a list of wetlands of international importance, and that list is maintained by the Secretariat in Gland in Switzerland. 2.2 then establishes broad criteria for listing wetlands of international significance. And you'll see there that initially, at least, priority was to be given to wetlands of international significance insofar as they're relevant to waterfowl, which is defined under the convention to mean birds that are ecologically dependent on wetlands. So you can see there embedded in the convention text that nexus between the protection of wetlands and the preservation of waterfowl, which of course extends to migratory birds. Then Article 3.1 states that contracting parties shall formulate and implement their planning so as to promote the conservation of listed wetlands and more generally, as far as possible, the wise use of wetlands in their territory. And the concept of wise use is something that's been expanded upon by the contracting parties in particular Ramsar Convention resolutions that have been adopted by the Conference of the Parties. And then the last article that I just thought I'd draw your attention to is 4.4 because of that obvious nexus again between the protection of wetlands and waterfowl, which includes migratory birds. And it specifically says that the contracting parties shall endeavour through management to increase waterfowl populations on appropriate wetlands. And Professor Lay's already explained quite clearly that link between habitat that's provided by wetlands and then the health and conservation of migratory birds. So we've established that though it's now acknowledged that wetlands cover a range of different ecosystems and that they perform many what we might call ecosystem services, for want of a better word. For example, they store vast amounts of carbon, in some instances up to 10 times as much carbon as a tropical rainforest. They mitigate flooding events. They filter pollution and nutrients from water. They're of great cultural significance, including to Aboriginal people in Australia. It's widely acknowledged that they perform all of those different functions, but you'll see there in the text that very clear link between the protection of that habitat, wetland as habitat, and the conservation of migratory birds. Professor's already included a picture of the Flyway, so you'll be familiar with it already, but just to re-emphasize the link between this particular Flyway and the Ramsar Convention. So as I understand it, up here in Alaska and then in parts of Asia, including China, we have breeding grounds for these migratory birds, and then they fly down to non-breeding grounds in Australia and in New Zealand. And as Professor has already helpfully pointed out, in Australia, across this region rather, so in Australia and in China and other parts of that area, I think there are 60, you said, Professor, 60 Ramsar wetlands that are of relevance for the purposes of this particular Flyway. So further to that point, I noted before that the convention provides for the listing of wetlands of international significance as per specific criteria set out in the convention text and expanded upon in COP resolutions that have been passed by the contracting parties. China has listed 64 wetlands of international importance, which covers almost 7.5 million hectares. And Australia has listed 66 wetlands, which cover almost 8.5 million hectares. And just to provide very, very briefly a concrete example of that link, between migratory bird conventions, so Canberra, Rocamba and Jamba, and a particular site down here is Western Port, which is a Ramsar site in Victoria. And according to the site management plan for that particular site, it states that 30 species, so migratory species protected under those 3 bilateral migratory bird conventions, use that particular Ramsar site as habitat. And here you can see at a reasonably broad scale where those wetlands, those Ramsar sites are listed in China and in Australia. So you'll see a cluster of them up here in northeastern China, and again, a cluster in eastern Australia. Some of you would know that of that 44 in eastern Australia, 16 Ramsar wetlands are in the Murray-Darling Basin. And those wetlands and the Ramsar Convention provide, to a large extent, the constitutional basis of Australia's Water Act, which governs the regulation of water in the Murray-Darling Basin. So just quickly, some of the challenges that are associated with international environmental law, and in particular, multilateral environmental treaties. And these are challenges that some of you would be familiar with, also things that I've observed throughout my tenure as legal advisor to the Ramsar Convention. And the first of them relates to the very nature of multilateral processes. When you have a large number of countries from different parts of the world with different priorities, legal systems, cultures, socioeconomic backgrounds, invariably there's going to be a significant amount of negotiation that goes into the drafting of the text of the treaty, and then subsequently into the actual resolutions which are passed by the conference of the parties. And what this means is that there's quite a large degree of compromise, both in the treaty text and then in resolutions themselves. So as with most multilateral environmental treaties, the Ramsar Convention is a framework convention, which means that it is drafted quite broadly, and then it's up to individual contracting parties to determine how they will implement it in detail in their particular country. In terms of resolutions themselves, there's quite an extensive negotiation process that goes on to determine the text, and that can be quite difficult. Again, it means that there's a significant degree of compromise. On top of that, I'd also note that resolutions are not binding under international law. They're considered soft law instruments unless they have crystallized into what we call customary international law, which is one of the sources of public international law. And another major source of international law is, of course, treaties, of which the Ramsar Convention is an example. Just the last point I'd make there is that domestic environmental laws tend to be revised over time or repealed and replaced, hopefully by laws that are more fit for purpose. Because of the multilateral nature of treaties, revising treaty text can be quite difficult, and in my experience, contracting parties are quite reluctant to open up the text and begin renegotiating something that had been settled on some time ago. As a result, the Ramsar Convention's only been amended once in almost 50 years. The second challenge is that there is no enforcement mechanism in the convention text, and this is typical of environmental treaties. So there's no clear way to enforce a breach of the convention. In very rare instances where there's been a transboundary breach between two countries that have signed the convention that impacts on a site, you'll see that matter referred to the International Court of Justice. However, I'm only aware of one particular instance where that's happened. It's a famous case, Costa Rica versus Nicaragua. The International Court of Justice, as many of you would know, is also a voluntary jurisdiction. So it really depends on the willingness of those two countries to submit themselves to the jurisdiction of the court with a view to finding some kind of resolution to that dispute involving the convention. This is somewhat consistent with sovereignty, or the notion of sovereignty, which is built into most international, if not all international treaties. It's embedded in Article 2.3 of the Ramsar Convention, and it highlights the primacy of each nation state's sovereignty. And it's always really a delicate balance between these multilateral processes in international law and preserving the sovereignty of international states that are contracting parties to the convention. Further to this enforcement point, there's a fair amount of confusion around the role of the Secretariat. I'm occasionally contacted by people who ask why the Secretariat isn't doing more to enforce or implement the treaty. That is not the role of the Secretariat. The Secretariat has absolutely no mandate to implement the convention. That is really the mandate of individual contracting parties. The Secretariat, its role insofar as potential breaches of the convention are involved is limited to what's called Ramsar advisory missions, and they are by invitation only. So under the convention, if a particular party thinks that one of their listed wetlands is at risk of having its ecological character altered, then, or its ecological character has already been altered, and that they would like some kind of guidance from the Ramsar Convention Secretariat about how to manage that situation, they can invite the Secretariat to come, assess the site, publish a report, and assist them in their efforts to enhance the ecological character of that particular wetland. But again, it's an invitation only, and just to emphasise, the Secretariat has no enforcement or implementation mechanism under the convention. I've already touched on implementation. This depends entirely on the willingness of individual contracting parties to enforce the convention within their own jurisdictions, and the manner in which they do that will vary from country to country. The extent to which they conserve and restore wetlands varies quite considerably across the country, across the world rather. And then finally, just something I've noticed in my time as legal advisor to the convention is that sometimes countries or regions will use the Ramsar Convention to ventilate broader geopolitical concerns. And I've noticed that amongst different contracting parties at various meetings, there's a diversity of views about whether or not it's appropriate to be ventilating these particular issues via the convention, and whether the issues that are being raised significantly or sufficiently intersect with the purpose of the convention. Some contracting parties will say that the purpose of the Ramsar Convention is very scientific and technical in nature. Therefore, it's inappropriate to be ventilating broader geopolitical concerns. As a lawyer, I find this quite curious, though it is scientific in nature, technical in nature as a convention. It is a source of public international law, and it is subject to public international law. So arguably, if there's a sufficient nexus between those geopolitical issues and the convention itself, then the meetings of the convention are a legitimate forum to air those issues. But again, as I said, it's a challenge because amongst the different contracting parties, there's quite a variety of views about whether or not those broader issues should be ventilated in that context. And on to something more positive, the opportunities that arise in relation to multilateral and bilateral environmental treaties. So these treaties, and in particular the Ramsar Convention, which has been around for almost 50 years, they're a well-recognised, for want of a better term, brand. They're really quite effective for mobilising action at the local and regional scale. And I know from my work domestically in Australia, local communities are very attached to the Ramsar Convention and to the Ramsar wetlands that are located where they live. So in that sense, it's an excellent framework for global and regional action. Professor Lay has already referred to SEPA within the context of the Flyway. So that stands for Communication Capacity Building, Education and Participation. And under the Ramsar Convention, there's also a strong focus on SEPA. For example, to give you one concrete example, that is, of how it's been very effective globally, the Ramsar Convention has done a lot of work on World Wetlands Day, and you can see how that's mobilised people all over the world to agitate for better protection and restoration of wetlands. From my own observation, I'd say that environmental diplomacy, which is really what happens at the meetings of these particular MEAs, environmental diplomacy is really quite an effective way to deepen relationships between nation states. Within the context of the Ramsar Convention, you will see contracting parties coming together to co-sponsor and co-draft resolutions about particular issues. And this is, for example, a concrete way that China and Australia can collaborate moving forward in relation to the Ramsar Convention. They're also an excellent mechanism for information and knowledge sharing. I've had the privilege of working in China for the purposes of my work as a freshwater lawyer. And I was incredibly impressed by the sophistication of water law in China, but also the deep knowledge of experts in that country. So there are obvious opportunities for our two countries to be sharing our expertise, both in relation to environmental law, but within various scientific disciplines that relate to the protection of migratory birds and wetlands more generally. Professor's already spoken about the East Asian Australasian Flyway partnership, and he mentioned that it was adopted as a Ramsar regional initiative in 2005. Just quickly, Ramsar regional initiatives are initiatives, as the name suggests, where contracting parties in a particular part of the world come together and they formulate ways to improve the protection of wetlands in their particular region. And they take various forms, and the one that we have in our region is this particular partnership, which has already been discussed in detail. I just thought I'd quickly note that wetlands have been in decline for the last 100 years. And so again, under this kind of rubric of knowledge and information sharing, it's an opportunity for our countries to come together and explore innovative ways to really break the deadlock with respect to this destruction of wetlands, which is happening as a result of increased development pressure around the world. So in Australia, we recently passed what we call, or adopted under federal law, what we call the blue carbon method, which is a method for restoring blue carbon or coastal wetlands under our carbon farming legislation. So this is something that perhaps is ripe for discussion with our colleagues in China to see whether there are opportunities to provide incentives for people to protect wetlands using these kind of market-based mechanisms. And it's the mechanism that we're using in Australia for the new business that I've co-founded with a group of coastal scientists called, our business is called Restore Blue. Just quickly in relation to Canberra, Canberra is a bilateral treaty. So by definition, there are fewer heads in the room. It's far easier to negotiate and implement something when there's only 2 contracting parties as opposed to 172. So just quickly, in conclusion, we are confronting immense challenges when it comes to biodiversity loss around the world, and that includes in Australia and in China. We can all broadly agree that wetlands are vital habitat for migratory species, but unfortunately, we've lost somewhere in the vicinity of 70% of the world's wetlands since 1900, so the vast majority of them. They're only going to come under increasing development pressure. The global population is projected to reach 10 billion by 2050, and all of these people are going to have to be housed, fed, and clothed, and that will put increasing pressure on these delicate ecosystems. We need to be working together to try and overcome these challenges. I do think that multilateral environmental treaties and bilateral environmental treaties, though not binding, they are an excellent framework for cooperation at the global and the regional scale. Contracting parties do and must continue to work together with civil society and the private sector. And just on that final point, I'd note that global equity markets around the world are valued at some $120 trillion. In my view, we have to be directing this money or some of this money to social and environmental impact investment, including wetland restoration and conservation, if we are going to halt and reverse biodiversity loss and protect migratory birds. And why is this vital? Not only because of the intrinsic value of these remarkable ecosystems and species, but from the perspective of intergenerational equity, which is certainly embedded in a number of pieces of environmental law in Australia. I can't speak to whether it is in China or not, but I'd be curious to learn from my colleagues. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Emma, so much for that presentation. And yeah, I encourage everyone to have a look at Emma's business initiative, Restore Blue. It's absolutely fantastic. And I think just that last slide there, the importance of intrinsic value, and Emma and the professor as well mentioned, I think, ecosystem services at one point, and I don't remember, Emma said for want of a better word. Yeah, and you know, just the very sort of feeling, from this, from Restore Blue, I would not, sort of brand it that. I think its attention to the intrinsic inherent value of biodiversity is fantastic. Okay, thanks again, Emma. Now I had a question for you, but I'm going to hold that over until the end when we have the panel discussion, because quite a few questions have come through on the Q&A. So before we cross to the next speaker, I'm going to give some opportunities for these to be addressed. So let me just quickly get them. Yeah, so the first question there is to Professor Guangshen Lei. I don't know if you can see it there, Professor, in the Q&A box. I think you said you wanted to answer that live.
I see it. Yeah, I see it. Yeah.
Yeah, so go ahead. Emma, there's a couple there for you. You can just have a look maybe, and then let me know if you want to answer them now or in the panel discussion. Go ahead, Professor.
I can answer it now. I think the disease actually are a part of the nature. The migratory waterbirds has many diseases within with them in their body. So in many cases, those diseases are not harmful, but in extreme case, those birds, the disease may spread to domesticated birds or those chicks. So then has the problem. However, in both in Ramsar, in FAO, and in East Asia, Australasia Flyway, we have the special task force on avian influenza. So this is the monitoring actually advisory body and to develop monitoring schemes or programs to look at how those diseases are carried on by the migratory birds during their migration. So in many of the cases, those are actually, if we have the rules on managing the habitat to separate domesticated ducks or the chicks from the wild birds, this problem can be easily avoided. So in general, this is a part of the nature. So only things we need to make the management practices to address specifically to this issue. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor. Emma, you've got a few questions there as well. Would you like to quickly answer those? The one's from Nina is going to ask a question, I think, on live. But if you have an opportunity to answer those ones in the chat box first, then we'll cross over to Nina. There's another question just quickly from Qian Cheng. Excellent question again. I'm actually going to put a similar question to the panel at the end, so that will definitely be covered there. But Emma, please, when you're ready.
So is this the question about the enforcement mechanism, that one, Paul?
Yes. So
yes.
Yeah, so I'll quickly just read that out. There's two questions to Emma. Any news about Ramsar COP14 and outstanding issues in the negotiations and contentious points for and then there's, I think, one that's sort of attached to that as well.
Just looking for where the questions are. I can see one there about enforcement.
Okay, well, you speak to that one first, and then we can go from there. Okay.
But just quickly, I can answer the one regarding COP14. So COP14 was initially to be held in Wuhan in China last year in November, but was postponed. We had an emergency meeting of the Conference of the Contracting Parties in order to formally postpone the Ramsar COP to November this year. That is now following a standing committee meeting that I recently attended in Switzerland. That's now under review. And there's another emergency meeting of the standing committee tomorrow night, our time in Australia, to update us all on progress regarding where the COP will be held. But basically, it's looking like it's going to be held this year. It's just a question of where that location will be. it's been very difficult because of the pandemic. It's been very difficult for the host country, China, who's been working closely with the Secretariat to resolve issues as quickly as possible.
Yeah, I'm just going to take the liberty as the host to ask my question to Emma. I'm quite interested in that point you mentioned about the geopolitical tension and the Ramsar Convention. Just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit further, like are there any specific issues that are within the Ramsar context that are being affected? Because I have noticed here and there, some conventions are affected more by others, so it's not necessarily that general international law will be affected. So I'm just more interested in any specific issues or stormwater or so
there are things I can discuss because they were ventilated at the recent Standing Committee meeting in Switzerland. So just to provide a bit of context regarding the governance of the Ramsar Convention, you'd all know that the supreme decision-making body of any convention is the Conference of the Contracting Parties, otherwise known as the COP. And then the next governance body down is the Standing Committee. So the COP meets every 3 years, and that's all of the 172 countries, or any one of those countries that chooses to come. There are about 140 at the last COP in Dubai. And then the Standing Committee meeting is made up of a smaller subset of those countries, and their job is to really keep things ticking over from year to year. So there was a Standing Committee meeting in Switzerland a few weeks ago, and all of this is reported, so I can discuss it. But there were a couple of issues that came up of that nature. One, as you would expect, is the war in Ukraine. So that was quite a live issue and is reported on in the documentation from the meeting. And if you're interested, you can have a look at the details. And then another has involved the listing of wetlands in non-autonomous territories. So territories that are not under international law, part of a particular nation state, but notwithstanding that, the nation state has listed a wetland in that particular region. And questions have arisen about whether or not that's lawful and whether or not it should be dealt with within the context of the convention. So they're two examples. At previous meetings, including the last COP, there were issues raised around transboundary water sharing, for example, in the Middle East. So they kind of vary from meeting to meeting. And as I said, there's kind of a variety of views around amongst contracting parties about whether or not it's appropriate to discuss them. I have my views as a lawyer, but my role at the convention is not to share my views unless they're asked for. It's really, sometimes it's more appropriate for the contracting parties to resolve matters diplomatically, if possible.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you for the question.
Thanks, Din. Yeah, that's the question I was going to actually hold over to the panel, so we've got that one done. All right, so thanks, Emma. We're going to move to the next speaker now, Assistant Professor Binbin Li, who will be speaking on involving citizen science to solve emerging challenges for migratory birds. So, sorry, just changing screens. So, Assistant Professor Binbin Li is at the Environment Sciences of the Environmental Research Center at Duke Kushan University. She holds a secondary appointment with the Nicholas School of the Environment at Duke University. She is the IUCN Species Survival Commission expert, associate editor of Frontiers of Ecology and Evolution, and serves on the editorial board of Conservation Biology, Global Ecology, and Conservation and Biodiversity Science. Her research focuses on endangered and endemic species conservation in China, such as giant pandas, priority setting and management of protected areas, and sustainable infrastructure building in the Belt and Road Initiative. She promotes to use innovative technology, market tools and policies to solve conservation problems and assist local community development. Assistant Professor Li has been awarded the EC50 by Explorers Club, one of the world's most inspiring explorers. She's engaged in science communication and nature education, and is assigned nature photographer in China, and directed the documentary Secret Worlds of Min Mountain's Wanglang. From 2013 to 2015, she was on the advisory board for the Disney nature documentary, Born in China. She is devoted to photography, social media, and drama in her work to promote conservation science throughout the public. Assistant Professor Binbin Li, I pass over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction. All right, so let me share my screen so you can see my screen, right? Okay, all right. So hello everyone, and it's my honor to be in this session, although I'm a newcomer for migratory birds like research. As what Paul has mentioned, most of my work actually concentrates on conservation planning, where we should protect. And most of the time, I'm trying to find synergy between biodiversity conservation and other themes, for example, climate change and sustainable development, because relatively biodiversity conservation is not mainstream yet. So how to find synergy and more support for this topic is very important. For example, we look at the hotspots of small range birds, mammals, amphibians, and figure out there is a high overlap between the hotspots of species and also landslide susceptibility. So the reason why we need more protected areas in this region, not only for protecting species, but also to reduce the landslide susceptibility. For example, we can restore forests for vegetation to protect the slope stability. But conservation is not just about rural areas, this mountainous area where like few people are, and or this flagship species every people pay attention to, or just the local communities, rural populations. But also in recent days, I realized there's a lot of work that we need to do in the urban environments, which we always regard as desert for biodiversity. But actually, there's a lot of species who reside around these areas, and with urbanization, there will be more conflicts between development and biodiversity. And also a lot of the demand for natural resources come from the urban populations, and how they view biodiversity conservation and species is very important for the future of conservation. So regarding birds, it's very interesting, as also the previous speakers have mentioned, the biggest threat actually is habitat loss, and especially for shorebirds, for example, it's wetland. But for other species, it could be deforestation, it could be mining, and it could be infrastructure building. Nonetheless, if we look at the other causes for direct like threats for birds, and it can be cats, feral cats in our residence area, but also collisions, especially collisions with buildings. It's second of the reason for the direct cause of death for birds. And the estimates just from the states alone, it will be 360 million to almost 1 billion birds per year, and colliding with buildings and building glasses. And the reason why birds collide with building, especially glasses, is relatively easy. The first one is we have a lot of glasses on our building right now, and they produce two illusions for birds. First one is transparency, especially when we have glasses on the corner or along the corridors or hallways, and birds think, okay, I can fly through these areas, no matter it's sky or it's vegetation on the other side. The other is reflectance, and a lot of the glasses, you can see the reflectance on them. For example, for birds, they see, oh, it's another patch of forest, because maybe this small building is just in a forest. So it just fly directly to that building and or that glass and cause death. And especially birds are very fragile and they fly in high speed. So the results of this collision is always death. And the other very important reason is the nighttime light, especially during migration season. And this light causes illusions and also confuse birds. And they come around like urban areas and they may collide with the buildings. So the picture showing here is the lights from the twin towers from the New York City, and they have to turn off the light to let the birds go. Otherwise, they will just like fly around these lights for a long time. So as you can see, migration is one important factor here. And bird collision happen at high frequency, especially during migration season. And migratory birds tend to collide more due to their high abundance during migration seasons, and also they're unfamiliar of the local environments. So for some resident birds, and when they grow up in urban settings, sometimes they learn to avoid the buildings, but for migratory birds, they usually come to this environment for the first time of their life. And also, buildings, they have different characteristics. The ones with a lot of glasses definitely will cause more collisions. And also the shape of the buildings, if they look like a tunnel, and then the birds tend to fly through the tunnel until they hit the wall or the glass. And different birds, they also have different vulnerability to bird collision on buildings. And whether the buildings are surrounded by vegetation will matter a lot. We may say, okay, if there's no vegetation, probably it will avoid the collisions, but we want our buildings, we want our urban areas to be green. So people usually have trees, but also if we have a lot of good environment around these areas, and the reflectance will make it worse. So how to reduce the collision in this environment will be very important. And also, weather is very important as well. So for the weather, when there is storm and the cloud usually will lower the flight height for the migratory birds. And this will cause more collisions, especially, for example, for New York City. And they find a lot of collisions, and especially after storms. So how to forecast the weather, especially during the climate change impacts, and to understand how the extreme weathers will cause more or less bird collisions around this area will be very important. But the attention for this issue is relatively low, and most of the studies are around North America. So basically in the United States or in Canada. And if we look at other areas, for example, China, we just have one study we recently published about this issue. So people began to pay attention to these threats, but relatively compared to other threats, is still under the radar. So from 2018, we start this project first on our campus, because we think the main power for changes are the public. So we involve students and staff first, and trying to do systematic survey, identify the hotspots for bird collisions, and then to use interventions, for example, retrofit the glass. So if we just follow the 5x10 or 5x5 rule, so if you have line stickers or point stickers, if they're smaller than 5 centimeters in distance, and then the birds, most of the birds think they cannot fly through these areas. So this is a retrofit windows at Duke University, and right now we have that in Duke Queensland University as well, and that dramatically reduced the bird collisions. So the intervention is relatively easy and low cost most of the time. And also the results also changes the second phase design for the campus. So from the root, reduce the use of glass. And we are not just go for LEED certificates. We want it to be real environmental friendly, which involve biodiversity. And since 2021, we initiate the China National Bird Collision Survey. And why is that? The first one is China, as the previous speakers have mentioned, in a really important region, especially for migratory birds migration, and especially the urbanization concentrated on the east coast of China. So here we have most of the potential conflicts between bird conservation and also development. And second, most of my previous research are in wilderness. And it's kind of hard to connect the public with what's happening in the rural areas because it doesn't matter to their daily life. However, if they see a dead birds just around their building, around their home or office, the shock is very different. So a lot of volunteers, they actually act on their emotion. They say, we don't want to see any dead birds around my residency areas. What should I do? And now they have a way to do it. First, participate in the survey, provide scientific data, and second, act on the data. So since 2021, we have more than 300 volunteers participated, and they spent a month every day in a row to survey their building, and especially during the fall and spring migration seasons, and cover more than 79 cities, and including primary students. And they are really engaged with this activity. And for our first survey, and similar to other research, we find out most of the birds, about 64% of the dead birds from the collision are migratory birds. And also not just the skyscrapers are high risk area, and actually a lot of low buildings, they have higher frequency of collisions. And there are a lot of confounding factors there as well. For example, there's a lot of vegetation, so they have more birds around this area from the start. So there's a lot of factors to consider, but we should not just blame the skyscrapers. If you have a low buildings, but you have a lot of glasses, especially for China right now in the wetland parks, in any parks, people love glass buildings, but they are not beautiful at all. They can be very deadly. And we also encourage and direct a lot of interventions as well. So these are all from our citizens, volunteers, and they just retrofit the window and or their glass rails around their homes. And there's a lot of encouraging sign. And also, we see a growth of media attention and discussion about this issue in the public. And we're just tracking the media reports, and from almost no mention about bird collision in 2018 and to more than like right now, it's probably like around 80 or 90 media reports about this issue, and people begin to talk about that. And that's very important, and also to understand what caused the bird collisions. So then in 2022, we formed the China Anti-Bird Collision Action Alliance with a lot of NGOs, research institutes, and also companies, industries as well. So we still, based on the citizen science as the very powerful tool to provide the data and the evidence for actions, and also provide portal for information sharing and data sharing, and also encourage the action from the public. But the final goal is we can promote changes in industries. So just to promote changes in people who care about that is not enough. And the education and also awareness should go beyond conservationists. It should go into urban designers and architects and these people. So actually, there's a lot of good examples already. For example, we can just change the building design, what kind of like materials that we want to use, especially right now. The mitigation for climate change, people pay a lot of attention to energy efficiency. And sometimes the materials you use can both benefit carbon reduction, but also reduce bird collisions. And retrofit glass, as we have mentioned, and also new glass. For example, the glass I showed here, they just have dots embedded in this glass from the very start. It's not very hard, and for glass companies, they already have tons of like glasses people can use. So this can reduce the reflectance and transparency of the glass. Or there's like people have their very arts flavor and they embed other arts into the building design. For example, in the library here in the university, and then they have put patterns of forest on their glass. And it's a very good match to the real forest and trees outside the library. So there's a lot of innovation people can do. It just need to tell the architects and people who are doing urban design, this is an issue and you can use innovative ways to solve this issue. And not just from the public, and a lot of time we're questioned, what is the cost? And people care about the cost. And how to consider this issue, I think we can consider from two different ways. First, think of the glass, the price was very high. However, the demand for glass, especially using glassy buildings, was high, and then the production increases, and then the price dropped. And now everyone can use glass freely if they want to build a building covered with 100% glass. So it's whether we can create the demand for bird-friendly glass. The second, so just rely on voluntary use of this glass, maybe with more price. Will that be a long-term issue? A solution, maybe. And New York City provide another way of doing that. They actually put this into legislation. So they have done a long-term citizen science program, accumulate a lot of data. And then they form this alliance with NGOs and architectural firms and voluntary layers and advocates. And they also connect with the council member and bring the bill to the city council in 2019 about using the bird-friendly building materials. And in January 2020, and this bill was passed by the city council and become the local law 15. And it became effective and since 2021 January. So in this one, it requires buildings that are built or altered after January 2021 to have the following structures built with bird-friendly materials. So including all the buildings that are lower than 75 feet, so which is about 23 meters. You have to use bird-friendly materials because this is the areas where most of the birds collect. And if you have any bird hazard installations, for example, you have a glass sticking out on the exterior, or you have fly-through conditions that make the birds confused. I can fly through these areas, or its adjacency to green roofs. And because birds may stay here, when they fly, take off, they may collide with the windows. So they specify the areas where these new buildings or outer buildings need to use the new materials. And that creates actually a lot of fight back, of course, during the hearings, because that means more cost. But they pass this, and now there's a lot of companies who are asking around, how should we produce these glasses? And because when it becomes a law, you have to follow that, and that actually accelerates a lot of business opportunities. So a lot of the solutions rely on two parts, one from the public and one from policy. And that's what we hope and to change here in China, and hopefully like along the Flyway and to other countries. So one thing we're always considering is how we mainstream biodiversity conservation. And I think most of the time is to change the attitudes, to understand the problem and also how to view the world and how we view what is development, whether quick growth of GDP is development, or whether this kind of city is really a livable condition, and whether these buildings are beautiful, and that do they really mean development? Maybe not, because they haven't considered a lot of the lives around this area. And what could be a beautiful building? And for me, it's like this. We can see the plants grow around the walls. We can see the other types of lives live around us. And we can see the connections between people, but also between human and other life forms. And that will be more livable cities. And when we have that attitudes, and then when we extend the issue to other types of ecosystems, wetlands and or forests, and it will be not that hard to let people to understand the complexity, the challenges, and also the need for solutions. All right, that's all from me.
Thank you, Bin Li. That was fantastic. I think some of the presentations we've had earlier today, we've often compared or related rather biodiversity law or laws regulating biodiversity to climate change. And that was fascinating because it shows that principles of green design, sustainable design, are not just all about climate change, mitigation or adaptation to climate change. There's a clear biodiversity protection and conservation element to it as well, and that should be integrated into those ideas. And it is really important. I really like that last point, or penultimate point you made, where you said it's important to conserve and protect biodiversity in forests and wetlands, and of course it is, but urban biodiversity as well is such an important part of preserving biodiversity broadly. And it's not just a question of people moving into an area and clearing the biodiversity out. It's a question of saying, well, that was here and we have to now adapt to that. So I think that was, yeah, fantastic and fascinating insight. Thank you. I have a question for you as well, but I think I will put that to the panel in terms of climate change and how that may be affecting migratory patterns. Okay, thank you, Bin Lee. So we'll now move to our next speaker, Dr. Birgitte Hansen, who will be speaking to us on the challenges for conservation of migratory shorebirds in the East Asian Australasian Flyway. So Birgitte is a senior research fellow at the Centre for E-Research and Digital Innovation at Federation University, where she manages research projects relating to citizen science, natural resource management, and digital agriculture. Her primary research focuses on the conservation of shorebirds, waterbirds, and their wetland habitats, with a growing emphasis on achieving conservation outcomes through technology enablement. Birgitte is a long-term member of the Victorian, I'm not sure if it's WADA or WADA. WADA, thank you, study group, and an executive committee member of the Australasian WADA Studies Group and International WADA Study Group. She's also a member of the IUCN Woodcock and Snipe Specialist Group. Birgitte is leading the Latham Snipe Project, which is a national citizen science project investigating the movement patterns and habitat use by Latham snipe. Birgitte, I'll pass over to you.
Thank you very much, Paul. I'll just attempt to screen share. If you just bear with me a moment. All right, it looks to me like that might be working. So yeah, look, I'd like to thank the organisers for inviting me to speak today alongside some highly esteemed colleagues. I've really enjoyed the talks I've heard so far, and I've noticed that there's going to be a little bit of overlap between some of the material presented already by Professor Lay and Dr. Carmody in my own talk. So I'll try and gloss over that fairly quickly, as you'll already have that background. Just for context, I've been working as a shorebird ecologist for probably a couple of decades now. So my background is very much around the management and monitoring of migratory shorebirds. I don't have a legal background, just to preface this talk. And so today what I'd like to do is talk about the migratory shorebirds in the East Asian Australasian Flyway that are listed under the China-Australia Migratory Bird Agreement. To do so, I'll just give you some quick background about shorebirds, what they are, where they occur, threats, managing habitat, and the agreements that we've been talking about today, and some concluding remarks about conserving shorebirds. So I'll just jump in now and let you know that the word wader is the other word for a shorebird. That's actually the British term. Shorebird is an American term. So migratory shorebirds or waders are typically long-legged birds, and they forage or they feed in wetlands and intertidal areas. They've got long wings that are adapted for these long distance endurance flights. So most people will be familiar with migratory shorebirds as the ones that conduct these enormous migrations, often non-stop for many days, between their northern hemisphere breeding grounds and the southern hemisphere non-breeding grounds of places like Australia and New Zealand. They're generally congregatory in those stopover areas. So you can see this image of a group of redneck stints that's been taken in Victoria at one of Victoria's Ramsar sites, the Western Treatment Plant. And they tend to congregate like that in areas where there's plentiful food resources. And throughout their life cycle, they require a range of different habitats to survive. So they have their breeding grounds, they have their migration stopover sites, which are often referred to as staging sites, where birds refuel through feeding, and then their non-breeding locations or overwintering locations. So you've seen this figure already that Professor Lay has shared with you. There are 9 global flyways. So a flyway is a collection of migratory routes used by a range of different species. And as Professor Lay pointed out, that the East Asian Australasian flyway, this one in the centre, is the largest of the 9 global flyways and contains 22 countries. And there are 10 bilateral agreements within the flyway that pertain to conservation. And the important point, of course, that's already been made by our other speakers is that the conservation of migratory birds across the flyway relies on cooperation between those countries. So just zooming in on the East Asian Australasian flyway, we've got this figure here, just is a representative of where birds breed, which is in the yellow colours at the top. Where birds spend their non-breeding season, so down here in Southeast Asia and Australasia, and then one of their key migration stopover points, or a bottleneck site, as you could possibly call it, and that's the LAC. And many species that breed in the northern latitudes and in the Arctic migrate through the LAC to reach their non-breeding grounds and return by that region, although there are some species that migrate directly across the Pacific to Alaska. Many of these migratory species are actually Arctic breeders, so breeding above the Arctic Circle, but there's also a number of species that breed below the Arctic Circle. So for example, in China, there's the critically endangered Far Eastern curlew, breeds in northern China. And then the Latham snipe, which Paul mentioned, that I've been conducting a national monitoring program on. For anyone who's familiar with the Japan-Australia Migratory Bird Agreement will recognise that that's a key species listed under that agreement, and it breeds predominantly in northern Japan. A lot of these migrants are using coastal habitats as they're moving through the flyway, but many are also using other wetland habitats, including inland wetlands, freshwater wetlands. They can be artificial, they can be high altitude lakes, they can be agricultural areas. So huge range of habitats, wetland habitats, intertidal habitats, and even grassland habitats support these species in the flyway. So a quick snapshot of Arctic breeding habitat. The key point really to make here is that there are quite a lot of species that do breed in the Arctic, and they've got a really strict timetable for arrival and departure. And this is because there's about a 6-week window where the permafrost melts, enables birds to have their nests, lay their eggs, hatch their chicks, and fledge those chicks before the snows return. And it's during that period that there's a big flush of insects and other invertebrates in that brief summer that the birds capitalise and feed on. The birds that are migrating through their through staging areas and down into their non-breeding areas are relying extensively on wetlands, including intertidal mudflats. And these provide really important foraging or feeding habitat for these species. And a lot of them are feeding on invertebrates and insects, so they might be on the surface or in the sediments. And the feeding requirements of these species is what will dictate their distribution during their non-breeding season. So just in this little example here, the birds that are feeding in intertidal mudflats, they're going to be spread out across these mudflats at low tide. And then as the tide comes up, it pushes the birds up into these high tide areas, which are called roost areas. And you can see from this image a large congregation of shorebirds at this high tide roost, waiting for the tide to drop. And so we will often see shorebirds in these huge congregations, particularly in areas that contain suitable food resources. And I think we've already had a very good snapshot on some of the threats that are occurring to migratory shorebird survival. The biggest one, of course, is habitat loss, and the loss of intertidal habitats in places like the LAC, but elsewhere as well in the world, has had significant impacts on shorebird populations. But we've also seen extensive loss of wetland habitat, and this is a problem that continues to pose threats to shorebirds, as Dr. Carmody pointed out. But we've also got problems with hunting across many parts of the flyway, hunting and then predation by both introduced and native predators exerts quite a bit of pressure on species in parts of the flyway. Competition for food is an issue, and over the top of this, of course, climate change pose many risks for many species, particularly those Arctic breeding species. And this is just an image showing one of the large reclamations that's occurred in the LOC that's caused significant loss of intertidal habitat for migratory shorebirds. This is the Saemanggum in the Republic of Korea, and that was closed off with a 33-kilometre sea wall. I think it was in 2006, and caused complete loss and dieback of all those food resources in that area. And as a consequence, there was very large declines in species that migrated through that region, particularly species like great knot. And this image, produced by colleagues of mine at the University of Queensland, just shows that the decrease in species in a range of migratory shorebird species that occur in Queensland is proportional to their reliance on the LOC as a migration stopover. So that's definitely been a major issue for shorebirds, among others. So how do we deal with these problems? Well, the most important thing is to protect and manage important habitat to ensure shorebird survival. And as we've seen, because they migrate through so many nations, then this poses some significant challenges to try and conserve and manage their habitats because of those migratory life cycles and their reliance on habitats in different countries. And so management needs to really operate at two scales. We've got the protection of sites and the management of sites at the site-based scale, so like Ramsar wetlands, for example, and then we have flyway-based actions that need to occur because these species rely on a network of sites distributed across the flyway, and it's necessary to manage those all together. And so that management of sites is very much underpinned by the legislation and policy. And in our flyway, we have the Ramsar Convention, which of course protects wetland sites. And then we have the migratory bird agreements, which is focus on shared species between the countries. So I know that Dr. Carmody's already talked about Ramsar. I don't think I need to go into a lot of detail, except just to remind you that it's not just about birds, it's actually about biodiversity and about human use of wetlands. And it focuses on sites, not on particular species. And there's an obligation under the convention to maintain the ecological character of those wetlands. And there's 9 criteria which are used to list wetlands under the Ramsar Convention, and 2 of those criteria relate entirely to waterbirds. So criterion 5 is sites that support 20,000 or more waterbirds, and criterion 6 is sites that support 1% or more of the global population of a species. So how do we understand what those numbers are? And that's through monitoring of populations. And so we need to monitor populations to get data and information about those population sizes and trends. And it's the population size estimates that underpin those Ramsar thresholds, and they also underpin thresholds for Australian national legislation, the EPBC Act. And that information is obtained through population monitoring, usually at quite large scales. So in the East Asian Australasian Flyway, most of our monitoring, which has been done for decades now, is conducted by volunteers. And the largest in scale is the Asian Waterbird Census. And these little yellow dots just give you a bit of a feeling for the distribution of Asian waterbird census sites. But the longest running of the monitoring programs is the Australian Shorebird Monitoring Program. And these are the programs that have delivered to us the data and information we need to understand what's happening with population trends across the flyway. So the China-Australia Migratory Bird Agreement, as you know, was ratified in 1988, and it is legally binding, placing obligations on the Chinese and Australian governments to protect migratory birds in their habitats. And that includes reducing hunting impacts, taking of eggs, taking of individuals. However, it's important to point out that the agreement doesn't cover the entire range of a lot of species. So that protection is not complete. And the inability to, the lack of compliance mechanisms does diminish the effectiveness of the migratory bird agreement, of all the migratory bird agreements, including the Japan, Australia, and Republic of Korea Australian agreements. As part of CAMBA, there is a provision for jointly funded research by the Australian and Chinese governments. And it's interesting to point out that since that agreement has come into effect, most of the joint research has actually been spearheaded by non-government organisations and universities. So in Australia, universities like University of Queensland, and obviously in China, the Beijing Forestry University, and probably the main joint funding between the two governments has been around establishment of the national bird banding offices and sharing of information between those offices. So it was the bird banding data on roseate terns that caused that roseate tern to be added to the treaty annex. But there has, of course, been indirect support from the governments, particularly towards university research and NGO work, which is in line with the agreement obligations. So under Canberra, there's 81 migratory birds listed. So I'm obviously focusing on shorebirds today because that's my area of expertise, but there are other migratory birds that are not shorebirds. So of those 81, there are 38 migratory shorebird species, of which 13 do breed in China. And 33 of those species are listed as matters of national environment significance under our EPBC Act. So as a group, they're listed, but there's also 7 species that are listed in their own right under the Act, which includes the critically endangered species, curlew sandpiper great knot and far eastern curlew. Interestingly, there's 5 migratory shorebird species listed in the treaty that rarely occur in Australia. They're considered vagrant species, which means they hardly ever turn up in Australia. And therefore, it's very difficult for any Australian policy or management actions to protect these species. So they probably shouldn't really be on the list at all. And then there's one species that's missing that should be on the list, which is the Oriental Plover. And just to pick up on Lynn's question earlier in the chat, there's a lot of non-shorebird species, so waterbird species and non-waterbird species, so passerines that are listed under the treaty that shouldn't be there either, really, because they either don't migrate between Australia and China, or that migration is really limited, or they're vagrant species and they hardly occur in Australia. So that list really does need some revision and updating. So just to conclude, the successful conservation of shorebirds, in relation to the agreement, but in our Flyway, really relies on international cooperation. I noticed that was a strong message that came from the other speakers earlier in this panel session. And the conservation requirements for protecting shorebirds includes, the protection of important habitats, protection of food supply, the protection of species from hunting is a really important point, particularly threatened species, but also common species. Awareness raising and engagement of the public is a really, really important part of conservation of shorebirds, as all our speakers have pointed out. And some ways that societal practices can be changed might be through subsidies. So I think Dr. Carmody mentioned the blue carbon method. That's an example of a market-based interest to try and help change societal practices through incentives. But the conservation of shorebirds really does rely on the Flyway partnership, of course, but it does also need a binding agreement that does include hunting and not just habitat protection. And I just wanted to finish off my talk by pointing out, as Dr. Carmody has pointed out, that the Ukrainian-Russian war is an example of where the degeneration of our international cooperation will potentially have very significant impacts for shorebird conservation, given how many shorebird species do breed in the Russian Arctic. So it really behooves us all to do the best we can to support and grow that international collaboration. So thank you very much.
Sorry, thank you, Makita. Sorry, that was my fault. Very nice to see as well how all these talks and presentations are really complementary. If I understood some of the explanations correctly, the loss of some of those important areas that are used by migratory species to climate change is again something that I'd like to raise once we've all panelists have finished their individual presentations, and we can have a chat about that. So thank you, Birgitte. We'll move now to our final speaker for the panel, Dr. Ibnu Sitampul from what I've got, he's attached to the University of Canterbury still. And he'll be talking to us on protecting migratory waterbirds on the East Asian Australasian Flyway, the impact of obligations, strategies, and action plans under the Convention for Biological Diversity. Ibnu is a legal practitioner and a researcher. He recently received, well, I'm not sure, sorry, said how recently, but has a PhD from the University of Canterbury, New Zealand. His research interests include international environmental law, international climate law, international biodiversity law, forest law, and disaster law. He's particularly interested in exploring potential solutions to various forest-related problems, such as deforestation, in an effort to address climate change and minimize biodiversity loss. He's currently working on a project related to migratory birds in New Zealand, and is involved in several projects relating to disaster law, law of the sea, and legal education. Ibnu, I'll pass over to you, please. You're on mute. You're on mute. Yeah.
Can you hear me? Sorry. Okay, I'm just gonna try to share my screen. Okay. It's good being last, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for having me and allowing me to this opportunity to share my view on issue relating to migratory birds under the East Asia Australian Flyway, or the EAAF. I would like to thank the Center for Environmental Law, Macquarie University, and the Research Institute of Environmental Law, Wuhan University, for hosting this important workshop, which outcome I believe will contribute to the protection of biodiversity as a whole. On this occasion, I'd like to discuss what impact can the 1992 Convention on Biodiversity, or the CBD, has in protecting migratory birds on the East Asian Australian Flyway. Maybe what I'm going to explain is it has been explained by other speakers, but I'm just going to be adding a little bit to what my view here. So the EAAF is one of the 9 major migratory bird flyways in the world. It's spread from Russia to New Zealand, consisting of over 50 million migratory birds from more than 250 different species. It is one of the busiest flyway on Earth. And, however, this flyway is also having the greatest number of migratory birds, both land birds and water birds, classified as threatened. The decline in population in many migratory water birds across this flyway has been well documented, but in recent years, land birds migrating along this route also suffer a dramatic population decline, which is driven by partly by habitat loss because of land use change, ongoing deforestation, as well as forest fire and pollution occurring in countries along this flyway. And my discussion today is going to focus on a small portion of these huge issues, right? There is the protection of migratory birds stopping in the protection of migratory bird stopping spots in Southeast Asia, particularly in Indonesia, where it is located in the heart of the EAAF. I'm going to talk about this bit here. It's a very important location for some migratory birds to rest and feed during their long migration south or north. Indonesia, known to be the world's second most biodiverse country, and its forests and wetlands are known to be among the world's richest ecosystem. Migratory water bird that fly south from China to Australia and New Zealand, or fly north from Australia, some may directly fly 9,000 kilometers in one go, and some may stop in Indonesia to rest and refuel. There are many factors that cause this separation in flying route. One of them would be climate change. It is a factor that can have an effect on the timing of migration. but also can become one factor that can give pressure and that could cause a change in migration pattern for these birds. Data shows that there are a significant number of migratory birds population in various different species of landbird and waterbird, stopping in numerous forests and wetlands in Indonesia, especially in island of Sumatra and Java. Although some are local migration, others are migrating under the global flyway, which in this case is the EAAF. Some of these birds are species that are not originally found in Indonesia, but they are normally spotted in the northern part of Australia, which indicates that these birds are adapting the way they migrate. And in the last 20 years, some birds decided to stop and feed halfway before continuing their long journey. And data shows that there are many places in the remote part of Indonesia where migratory birds are resting, especially along the coast of Aceh, North Sumatra, and Java. For example, formerly, great knot known to be migrated directly from northwestern part of Australia to the Yellow Sea, but now thousands of them are migrating through the northern Sumatra, the Malaysian Peninsula, and the Gulf of Thailand. This has been evident since 2010 and is now increasing. Clearly, a sizable thousand of them breaking migration in half. Additionally, other species, particularly like Pacific birds, also found in stopping in Papua and some smaller Indonesian islands like Sumbawa and Flores before continuing their long journey to Australia. Importantly, this fact shows that it is highly significant and necessary to protect these migratory birds' transitory sites and their resting habitat, particularly in Indonesia and other Southeast Asian countries. Indonesia has one of the largest forest and wetland area in the region, which means that they may accommodate more number of migratory birds in transit compared to its neighboring country. It is just an ideal place for this bird to rest and refuel. Unfortunately, for many years, up until today, forest and wetland areas in Indonesia is under ongoing threats from human activities such as deforestation, land use change, which can lead to a more severe disaster like a forest fire, which in itself can cause serious harm and in fact mortality to these birds and biodiversity as a whole within and in vicinity of the forest and wetland area. This habitat destruction occurred every year and in massive scale. And I believe that this harmful activity contribute to the population decline of migratory birds in this flyway and ultimately impacted their population number. A number of bird species population in New Zealand, which are known to have gone through Indonesia, for example, decreases in recent years, and it's also the case in Australia and China. Therefore, it is critical for international community, particularly countries along the EAAF, to collaborate in developing initiatives to maintain the function of the flyway and to mitigate the loss to migratory birds. In this case, I'm looking at it from a point of view of obligation under the CBD. It is important to consider what obligation, strategy, or action plan exists under the convention that could help, that could be applied and have an impact on protecting these birds' resting and feeding habitat, and thus protect migratory bird and biodiversity as a whole, particularly in the area under the scope of the EAAF. And these are the threats that I was talking about. Yeah, first I'd like to focus on the implementation of in situ conservation, Article 8 of the CBD. Particularly Indonesia, for reason I previously explained. The development of conservation area can prevent habitat loss, and this includes conservation in forest and wetland areas. More importantly, however, is to ensure that these protected areas are well managed to benefit biodiversity, in this case, migratory birds. unfortunately, there are around 284 of the 556 conservation areas across Indonesia is still function under poor management. This area consists of natural reserve, national parks, wildlife reserve, nature park, covering more than 27 million hectares of highly biologically diverse forests. Additionally, only 27% of mangrove in Indonesia is in good condition, 48% in slightly damaged condition, and 23% in damaged condition. This would mean that most conservation area in Indonesia is still not functioning properly, and threats to migratory birds within this protected area are still highly present. I'm not advocating the government to create as many as conservation area as possible, although more conservation area will be beneficial, but I believe it is far more important to focus on properly managing them in accordance with the CBD guidelines and various COP decision on conservation issues. The CBD under Article 8M also encourage developed countries to provide financial and other support to developing countries in implementing in situ conservation. And in this case, China and Australia should have an interest in supporting the improvement and protection of transitory sites located in the heart of the EAAF, including effort to successfully implement a sustainable management of in situ conservation area in Southeast Asia, including or particularly in Indonesia. Secondly, it is important to raise public awareness in relation to these migratory birds and the importance of their resting habitat in Indonesia's forests and wetland. Article 13 of the CBD promote and encourage parties to raise awareness and on the importance of conservation of biodiversity. And I believe it's particularly important for China and Australia to collaborate with the Indonesian government, not only to improve an already placed awareness and education program, but also to establish new ones. However, this awareness program should not heavily focus on the importance of conservation on well-known land species only, such as tigers, elephant, orangutan, etc., but should also specifically promote more aspect on migratory bird species and how a well-managed conservation impact their long journey. This program should also focus on the importance of protecting the transitory sites of migratory birds, restoring their damaged habitat, and preventing threats to these habitats. And this program should also focus on describing the negative impact that a damaged habitat can have on migratory birds and their population counts in another country's jurisdiction. In this sense, the international and transboundary aspect of why is it important to protect Indonesia's forest and wetland would be emphasized, and this would pose an indirect pressure on the government and on other stakeholders to alter their behavior towards forest-related or wetland-related activity, which only bring positive impact on the migratory birds. Additionally, awareness program must also target the right audience, which I believe is one of the main problem for many of the current awareness program. Instead of focusing on NGOs, students, and researchers, as was done in Indonesia in 2018 and 2019, awareness program should be expanded to include more government officials, especially at the district and local levels, policymakers, corporate sector, and law enforcement officer, and the local people. So to conclude, what I've mentioned previously, in situ conservation and habitat protection has been implemented at the national level in Indonesia, but most of them has been poorly managed and thus have been ineffective to prevent threats to these migratory birds' resting spots, and has failed to protect migratory birds altogether. Similarly, awareness program under the CBD that have been running in Indonesia have not made a significant impact to protect migratory bird due to their lack of proper context and have less relevant target audience. And simply put, there is an issue in implementation of this obligation, of these two obligations of the CBD at the domestic level in Indonesia, which is somewhat understandable as forest is still one of the main sources of the country's economy, and local people is still very dependent on wetland for their day-to-day living. So the existence of a implementation mechanism is crucial, and this mechanism under the CBD is considered weak and insufficient as it is voluntary. Consequently, it is important for China and Australia to involve Indonesia in a multilateral agreement to adopt a robust monitoring and reporting mechanism, which will act as an implementation mechanism that will oversee habitat protection program, as well as various awareness and educational program in Indonesia. And also to maintain population number of birds migrating to these three countries. This mechanism will ultimately support the goals of the bilateral agreement of the migratory bird between China and Australia, that is to protect migratory birds and to stop its decline. And at the same time, it will contribute to the protection of biodiversity as a whole. I think that's all for me. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ibnu. Yeah, really fascinating insight there, I think, into how we could construct particular treaties, especially the Convention on Biological Diversity, to hopefully integrate Indonesia into Australia and China agreements and bring a stronger approach to global biodiversity generally. Yeah, thank you, Ibnu. Now, I'm sorry to everyone, we have gone over time, but I hope we can all bear with us just for another little bit so we can have a couple of questions to the panel as a whole, and then yeah, wrap up in about just under 10 minutes or so. So we'll just have the panel now on the screen. Doesn't look like there's been any other questions that have been launched through the chat or the Q&A at the moment, but I've got a couple of points that I think would be interesting for people to participate in and hopefully also to learn from. So the first one, I suppose, just builds on the back of what Ibnu has just concluded there in his presentation, and that's what every speaker thinks about how the agreement between Australia and China, other multilateral treaties as well, such as Ramsar, how does this all then link up to the Convention on Biological Diversity, particularly looking forward to the meetings in China later this year? So I'll put that as the first of two questions to the panel, and we'll sort of start, I think we'll sort of go in reverse order of speakers. So we'll start with you, Ibnu. Sorry, I didn't give you much of a break there, but we'll start with you, and then we'll move sort of back to the professor. Oh, sorry, you're on mute again, Ibnu.
Sorry, I can't really hear the question before, so maybe.
Oh, that's okay.
Oh, yeah.
So basically, you know, what you've discussed today, your findings, and how would you link that back to the Convention on Biological Diversity? I mean, does it help? Does it hinder?
No.
What are the potentialities?
It's going to help the effectiveness of the Convention of Biodiversity, of course, because as of now, a lot of people think separately, but birds, right? when they talk about biodiversity, mostly they talk about the land animal, the famous one, the almost extinct one, the tigers, the elephant. But we not many of them are talking about the birds. These are, I think, the one who have a lot of population, and it's not being in the what do you call it, in the center of any biodiversity talk internationally, most of them. And that's why I think it is very important to for this convention of biodiversity to focus more on birds, and maybe not singling out any issue on the decline of waterbirds, especially.
Thanks, Ibnu. Sorry about that. Bagita, we'll go to you next.
Thanks, Paul. I'm probably not very well placed to answer that question because I don't know CBD very well, but I suppose a broader comment I would make is about that I think migratory shorebirds and migratory birds probably do slip between the cracks a little bit sometimes in agreements, especially those that aren't threatened. And then one of the points I made during my talk is about site-based protections. That's problematic for migratory species because you need to manage networks of sites. So that doesn't really quite answer your question, but that'd probably be my 2 pennies worth there.
No, that was fantastic. Thank you. No, very, very interesting insight. Bin Lee, can we go to you now, please?
Yep. So I think one of the issues that CBD sorry, there's echo from you. I don't know, some internet issue. Okay, now I'm back. So one thing talk a lot is about 30 by 30, so protecting 30% by 2030. However, we realize 30 by 30 is not the scientific goal, it's a political goal. So 30% definitely is not enough, but 30% is already very hard for a lot of areas, even for us in China. Putting red line together is towards 30, but there's still like maybe 3% left. So what should we do with the rest? And also the areas that are not legally protected. We definitely need more effective conservation and restoration methods. So I think when we talk about protected areas, definitely they're the cornerstone, but we have to realize there are limited areas that we can have legal protection. So we have to think of innovative ways of protecting these areas that are very important. So that's why we care a lot about what is the synergy between biodiversity conservation and development, and whether we can change the mindset of these developers. So just putting something in their plan can benefit this species. That would be very important. So definitely, I think that's beyond post-2020 biodiversity framework, but restoration is also one important goal. But how to do restoration and how to put that into development plan and how to conserve the areas that we cannot conserve under 30%. I think that definitely helped with the CBD.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, very, very good point, political point. Emma, yeah, can we go to you, please?
Yeah, sure. I'd make a couple of different points. The first is that at every Ramsar COP, there's a specific standard resolution which concerns synergies between the Ramsar Convention and other related conventions, of which the Convention on Biological Diversity is an obvious example. So at the last Ramsar COP, which was the 13th COP, it was resolution 13.7. And it sets out quite specific things relating to the connections between Ramsar and CBD. So for those of you who are interested, it might be worth referring back to that particular resolution. The second point that I'd make is that while multilateral environmental agreements and synergies between agreements are an excellent mechanism for raising awareness, and everybody has spoken about the importance of education, and I wholeheartedly agree with those comments. I think at the end of the day, it will always depend on local implementation. So we all have to consider, how do we motivate our individual nation states to better implement the obligations set out in each of those respective treaties, whether it's the bilateral treaties, CBD or Ramsar. The third point I'll briefly make is really about examining the barriers to implementation. And this is something really my legal practice initially was very focused on. What does good environmental law look like? And I still think that's crucial. But increasingly, as a practitioner, I started to kind of examine the barriers to implementation of environmental laws. And it's a problem everywhere in the world. It's not particular to one country, to the global north, to the global south. Universally, environmental laws tend not to be well implemented because of the tension between development and protection of the commons. So I've started to look at the barriers, and that's what really resulted in me moving away from practicing domestically as an environmental lawyer and focusing on actually working on practical methods to restore wetlands in Australia. So if you can incentivize private landholders to restore those blue carbon wetlands on their properties, you really go a long way to resolving one of the chief barriers. So many wetlands are on private property. How do you incentivize those people to restore and protect those sites? So that they're probably the 3 points that I'd make.
Thanks, Emma. And Professor Guang Chunlei, if we could go to you, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think actually the East Asia Australasian Flyway partnership has gained a very important position to link international treaties, both CBD, Ramsar, and other international conventions to site networks in the Flyway region. So you can see our agreement is the partnership agreement. So the members are partners, including national government, international conventions, site networks, NGOs, as well as the corporate companies. And the key is to link migratory waterbirds conservation with the local sustainability. So the site management are really look at the ecological ecosystem services to local communities as well as to global scale on biodiversity. So the strategy from the EAFP, including the network sites, international collaboration, joint monitoring research programs, are protected areas. So these are much related to CBD and Ramsar Convention, and partially related to CMS. And this means the partnership is a non-binding but much more effective instrument for the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Well, thank you again for all of those answers. I think that's probably a really good point to end this panel discussion. I think bringing it back to the Convention on Biological Diversity and looking toward the future. Well, this year's negotiations and beyond. So I'm going to bring the session to a close there. The only other point I was going to make was about climate change, but I think we could probably have a whole nother panel on that. So I'll bring the panel to an end there. I'd like to thank our participants again for fascinating, insightful, committed presentations, the different perspectives, but yet all adhering to the central research theme that we have all been brought together to discuss over these 2 days. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone who has tuned in. Thanks for, of course, bearing with the going over time there. Ibnu as well. I know it is past 8 o'clock now in New Zealand, so thank you especially to you. Yeah, please everyone, if you can, register and join us tomorrow. I think from 11 a.m. Sarah, yes, thank you. 11 a.m. Sydney time. All right, thank you everyone, and goodbye, good evening.
Bye. Thank
Bye.
you for your cheering.
Thank you. 谢谢.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank
you very much.
you, Emma. Thank you.